Was Walt Disney onto something when he froze his head? But the real question is, would it be possible for him to hold on to his intellectual property of Mickey Mouse if he thought about it a little bit smarter? I'm Layla Guyan, and today on this podcast we're going to explore the intricacies of copyright law, intellectual property, and the logistics of cryogenically freezing yourself to escape public domain, and the ethicalness of all of it. This idea sounds straight out of a science fiction movie, like an author with boundless creations and taking their selfishness to a new degree by sacrificing themselves to keep their legacy intact from the public domain. But there are holes in intellectual property laws that can be exploited for selfish gain. In laws relating to intellectual property and public domain, there are set rules on how creative works end up going into public domain. In the outlines in Canadian law, there are sorted sections that rule over what requirements and restrictions are set out to keep intellectual property from going into public domain. In media like cinematography or government publications, they'll expire after 75 and 50 years after the publication of the author. Meanwhile, in literary, dramatic, musical, engravings, photography, and artistic works, they will expire after the author or creator's death, plus another 7 years. So technically, would this law apply to a cryogenically frozen person if they technically didn't die? Now, a couple questions will be brought up regarding this topic. Number one is, what is the reasoning for copyright being in place, and does cryogenics abide by the ethicalness of media naturally entering public domain? The second is, if you never died, would you be able to use intellectual property law to avoid your copyright from going to public domain? And lastly, would the outlines in law consider a cryogenically frozen person to be dead or alive? The first topic we're going to handle is, what does copyright do, and why is it important that it can expire over time? Copyright is the exclusive legal right to produce, reproduce, publish, or perform an original work. An original work is described as an expression of artistic, literary, musical, or dramatic work. The reason that copyright exists is to protect the original author's work from unfair use of their product, for financial gain from others without permission. It also grants the author moral rights for the product. This includes attribution, which is the concept of the right to be credited, including the right to use a pseudonym. It also grants integrity, which means that their work cannot be modified or used in association that dishonors the original author's work. The reasoning behind the expiration of copyright and things automatically going into public domain is because it balances out the benefit for sharing and use of creative works and the right of the author. Because the law states the copyright can expire after 70 years after the author's death, the ethical reasoning behind it is that the author is alive for the entire time that they can benefit from their creation, and that their creative use of their products can be used afterwards to grow creative freedom. The next section we're going to tackle is death and the classification of cryogenically frozen people into it. Now, as for the hypothetical situation of an immortal hogging onto its intellectual property, sounds straight out of a science fiction movie, this might have some backing in our legal system. If a person lives forever, there is nothing in law that denies their right to keep their property from entering public domain. So on this train of thought, if living forever means that you can keep your intellectual property, then does cryogenics apply to this rule? In Canada, there is no legal definition for death. You cannot just die and be automatically declared as such. When you die, 2 physicians have to inspect your body and declare you as dead. If not, your assets will be tied up and unable to be claimed by your family, which includes your copyright. A select few provinces define death as, quote-unquote, the irreversible cessation of circulatory and respiratory functions, or the irreversible cessation of functions of the entire brainstem, including the brainstem. So, in those provinces, if cryogenics actually work properly, then the definition requirement as irreversible would not apply to the person inside because it would technically be reversible. If the person is not declared dead when frozen, they might go into a legal process called the presumption of death. There are many ways that declarations of death happen without a physician declaring it. One way is in common law in British Columbia, they will presume a person dead if they are not heard of for 7 years. There is one workaround the minimum in the Presumption of Death Act in 1996. If an interested person defined as someone who has a direct or indirect stake or claim in a legal matter such as a trust, estate, or contract brings an application to court to declare an individual to be legally dead, then they can go against the minimum amount of time it takes for the presumption of death to be declared. As well as outlined in the Presumption of Death Act in Section 5, which documents the rules of if the presumed dead person is later found alive, then it states that any property distributed is final and cannot be taken back, unless the interested person and the presumed dead individual settle it out in court. This means that technically the cryogenically frozen person wouldn't be able to be technically declared as dead, but due to this act, it would interfere with the legality of their state of body. If they were cryogenically frozen, then they would have to unfreeze themselves every 7 years to even hold on to the title of being alive. On top of all of this, copyright expires every year and needs to be renewed to keep their property. So overall, the question of could you cryogenically freeze yourself to avoid your property from going to public domain using the outlines of law is probably not. Even though the law for copyright states that it expires 70 years after the person's death, it would be almost impossible for the frozen person to keep up with the laws for death and the renewal process of copyright to avoid the property from entering public domain. This legal loophole that withholds creative works would misbalance authors and public rights of works, and why there are rules towards what goes into public domain. There are also issues of if cryogenics actually work, or will ever work on a whole body to achieve biostasis. It has been done on live cells, but on a live body is still far in the future. As well as in the hypothetical world where cryogenics worked 100% of the time, there would be a change in law to create more boundaries around keeping intellectual property indefinitely. This would allow us to properly balance authors' rights and sharing of media with the public to foster growth. That's all. I'm Layla Guyan, and thank you for listening.